The Discoverers, Chapter 14, A Flat Earth Returns. Can anyone be so foolish, asked the revered Lactantius, the Christian Cicero, whom Constantine chose to tutor his son, as to believe that there are men whose feet are higher than their heads, or places where things may be hanging downwards, trees growing backwards, or rain falling upwards? Where is the marvel of the hanging gardens of Babylon, if we are to allow of a hanging world at the Antipodes? St. Augustine, Chrysostom, and others of their statute heartily agreed that the Antipodes, antipodes, a place where men's feet were opposite, could not exist. Classic theories of the Antipodes described an impassable fiery zone surrounding the equator which separated us from an inhabited region on the other side of the globe. This raised serious doubts in the Christian mind about the sphericity of the earth. The race that lived below that torrid zone, of course, could not be the race of Adam, nor among those redeemed by the dispensation of Christ. If one believed that Noah's Ark had come to rest on Mount Ararat north of the equator, then there was no way for living creatures to have reached an Antipodes. To avoid heretical possibilities, faithful Christians preferred to believe there could be no Antipodes, or even, if necessary, that the earth was no sphere. St. Augustine, too, was explicit and dogmatic, and his immense authority, compounded with that of Isidore, the Venerable Bede, St. Boniface, and others, warned away rash spirits. The ancient Greek and Roman geographers had not been troubled by such matters, but no Christian could entertain the possibility that any men were not descended from Adam, or could be so cut off by tropical fires that they were unreachable by Christ's gospel. Yes, verily, declared Romans 10:18, their sound went forth over all the earth, and their words unto the ends of the whole world. Neither faith nor scripture had any place for beings unknown to Adam or to Christ. God forbid, wrote a 10th century interpreter of Boethius, that anybody think we accept the theories of Antipodes, which are in every way contradictory to the Christian faith. Belief in Antipodes became another stock charge against heretics prepared for burning. Some few compromising spirits tried to accept a spherical earth for geographic reasons, while still denying the existence of Antipodean inhabitants for theological reasons, but their number did not multiply. It was a fanatical recent convert, Cosmas of Alexandria, who provided a full-fledged Topographia Christiana, which lasted these many centuries to the dismay and embarrassment of modern Christians. We do not know his real name, but he was called Cosmas, Cosmas, on account of the fame of his geographic work, and nicknamed Indicopleustus, Indian traveler, because he was a merchant who traveled around the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean and had traded in Abyssinia and as far east as Ceylon. After his conversion to Christianity about AD 548, Cosmas became a monk and retired to a cloister on Mount Sinai, where he wrote his memoirs and his classic defense of the Christian view of the earth. This massive illustrated treatise in 12 books gives us the earliest surviving maps of Christian origin. Cosmas rewarded the faithful with a full measure of vitriol against pagan error and a wonderfully simple diagram of the Christian universe. In his very first book, he destroyed the abominable heresy of the sphericity of the earth. Then he expounded his own system, supported, of course, from Scripture, then from the Church Fathers, and finally from some non-Christian sources. What he provided was not so much a theory as a simple, clear, and attractive visual model. When the Apostle Paul in Hebrews 9:1-3 declared the first tabernacle of Moses to be a pattern of this whole world, he conveniently provided Cosmas his plan in all necessary detail. Cosmas had no trouble translating St. Paul's words into physical reality. The first tabernacle, quote, had ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary, for there was a tabernacle made, the first wherein was the candlestick, and the table and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. By worldly sanctuary, St. Paul meant, quote, that it was, so to speak, a pattern of the world, wherein was also the candlestick. By this meaning the luminaries of heaven, and the table, that is the earth, and the showbread. By this meaning the fruits which it produces annually. When Scripture said that the table of the tabernacle should be 2 cubits long and 1 cubit wide, it meant the whole flat earth was twice as long east to west as it was wide. In Cosmas's appealing plan, the whole earth was a vast rectangular box, most resembling a trunk with a bulging lid, the arch of heaven, above which the Creator surveyed his works. In the north was a great mountain around which the sun moved, and whose obstructions of the sunlight explained the variant lengths of the days and the seasons. The lands of the world were, of course, symmetrical. In the east, the Indians; in the south, the Ethiops; in the west, the Celts; and in the north, the Scythians. And from Paradise flowed the 4 great rivers, the Indus or Ganges into India, the Nile through Ethiopia to Egypt, and the Tigris and the Euphrates that watered Mesopotamia. There was, of course, only one face of the earth, that which God gave to us, the descendants of Adam, which made any suggestion of antipodes both absurd and heretical. Cosmas's work is still very much worth consulting as a wholesome tonic for any who believe there may be limits to human credulity. After Cosmas became a legion of Christian geographers, each offering his own variant on the scriptural plan. There was Orosius, the Spanish priest of the 5th century, who wrote a famous encyclopedia, Historiae Adversum Paganos, where he retailed the familiar threefold division of the world into Asia, Europe, and Africa, embellished by some generalizations of his own. Much more land remains uncultivated and unexplored in Africa because of the heat of the sun than in Europe, because of the intensity of the cold, for certainly almost all animals and plants adapt themselves more readily and easily to great cold than to great heat. There is an obvious reason why Africa, so far as contour and population are concerned, appears small in every respect, i.e., when compared with Europe and Asia. Owing to her natural location, the continent has less space, and owing to the bad climate, she has more desert land. Then the even more influential Christian encyclopedist Isidore, Archbishop of Seville, in the 7th century, explained that the earth was known as orbis terrarium because of its roundness, orbis, like a wheel. It is quite evident, he observed, that the 2 parts, Europe and Africa, occupy half the world, and that Asia alone occupies the other half. The former were made into 2 parts, because the great sea, called the Mediterranean, enters from the ocean between them and cuts them apart. Isidore's wheel maps followed the convention of time by putting east at the top. Paradise is a place lying in the eastern parts, whose name is translated out of the Greek into Latin as hortus, i.e. garden. It is called in the Hebrew tongue Eden, which is translated into our language as deliciae, i.e. a place of luxury or delight. Uniting these 2 gives us garden of delight, for it is planted with every kind of wood and fruit-bearing tree, also having the tree of life. There is neither cold nor heat there, but a continual spring temperature. From the middle of the garden, a spring gushes forth to water the whole grove, and, dividing up, it provides the sources of 4 rivers. Approach to this place was barred to man after his sin, for now it is hedged about on all sides by a sword-like flame, that is to say, surrounded by a wall of fire that reaches almost to the sky. Christian geographers who lacked facts to fill their landscapes found a rich resource in the ancient fantasies. While they were contemptuous of pagan science, which they considered a menace to the Christian faith, their prejudice did not include pagan myths. These were so numerous, so colorful, and so contradictory that they could serve the most dogmatic Christian purposes. While Christian geographers feared the close calculations of Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, and Ptolemy, they cheerfully embellished their pious Jerusalem-centered maps with the wildest ventures of pagan imagination. Julius Solenus, AD 250, surnamed polyhistor, or teller of various tales, provided the standard source of geographic myth during all the years of the Great Interruption, from the 4th till the 14th centuries. Solenus himself was probably not a Christian. 9/10 of his Collectanea Rerum Memorabilium, Gallery of Wonderful Things, first published about AD 230 to 240, came straight out of Pliny's Natural History, though Solenus does not even mention his name, and the rest was foraged from other classical authors. Solenus's peculiar talent, as a recent historian of geography observes, was, quote, to extract the dross and leave the gold. It is doubtful if anyone else over so long a period has ever influenced geography, quote, so profoundly or so mischievously. Yet, Solenus's dross had wide appeal. St. Augustine himself drew on Solenus, as did all the other leading Christian thinkers of the Middle Ages. The stories and fabulous images that Solenus retailed enlivened Christian maps right down to the Age of Discovery. They became an all-encompassing network of fantasy, replacing the forgotten rational gridwork of latitude and longitude, which had been Ptolemy's legacy. Solenus found wonders near and far. From Italy, he reported people who sacrificed to Apollo by dancing barefoot on burning coals, pythons that grew long and fat by feeding on the udders of milk cows, and lynxes whose urine congealed to, quote, the hardness of precious stone, having magnetic powers and the color of amber. Grasshoppers and crickets in Rhegium still dared to make no sound because Hercules, irritated by their noise, had once ordered them to keep silent. Further afield were the dog-headed simians of Ethiopia, ruled by a dog king. Along the Ethiopian coast were peoples with 4 eyes, while along the Niger were ants as big as mastiffs. In Germany, there was a mule-like creature with such a long upper lip that, quote, he cannot feed except walking backwards. Human monstrosities that were normal in remote parts of the world included tribes who had their 8-toed feet turned backwards, men with dogs' heads and talons for fingers who, quote, barked for speech, people who had only 1 leg, but with a foot so large that it protected them from the hot sun by serving as a parasol. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of that age, so familiar that it has lost its significance for us, was the Mediterranean. The Romans had called that body of water, the whole chain of inland seas between Africa, Asia, and Europe, Mare Internum, or Mare Nostrum. Solenus was one of the first to call these the Mediterranean seas, seas in the middle of the earth. The celebrated Isidore of Seville converted Mediterranean into a proper name, and the authority of Isidore was not to be gainsaid. While Christian geography in Europe was becoming this hodgepodge of fantasy and dogma, elsewhere people still advanced their knowledge of the earth and their ability to chart earthly space. The Chinese had quite independently, without the aid of Eratosthenes, Hipparchus, or Ptolemy, devised a grid pattern that they superimposed on the irregular surface of the earth. We have seen that what the clock did for time, the rectangular map grid did for space, performing uniform receptacles in which the endless variety of land and water, mountain and desert could be discerned, described, discovered, and rediscovered. While a spherical earth was the basis of the Greek cartography, a flat earth was the basis of the Chinese. By the time that Ptolemy had done his work in the West, Chinese cartographers had developed their own usable techniques of map grids and a rich tradition of world cartography, which happily grew without the amnesiac interruption that afflicted the West. The Greeks had developed their grid system along with lines of latitude and longitude so easily drawn around a sphere. But since it was so difficult to project a spherical surface in a flat sheet, in practice, the Greek grid system of latitude and longitude was not substantially different from what it would have been if they had conceived the surface of the earth as flat. Since the Greek grid system grew out of the requirements of a spherical shape, the Chinese rectangular grid, which made their whole cartography possible, must have had quite other origins. What were they? From the earliest political periods of the Qin era, 221 to 207 BC, we find numerous references to maps and their uses. China, unified in 221 BC, was both the creature and the creator of a vast bureaucracy, which had to know the features and the boundaries of its extensive regions. The rites of Chao, 1120 to 256 BC, had required the Director General of the Masses to prepare maps of each feudal principality and register its populations. When the Chao Emperor toured his realm, the Geographer Royal was at his side explaining the topography and products of each part of the country. Under the Han Dynasty, 202 BC to AD 220, maps appear again and again as the indispensable apparatus of empire. The last 2 millennia in China display a galaxy of cartographic talent. During the heyday of the religious cartography in Europe, the Chinese were marching steadily ahead toward quantitative cartography. Even before Ptolemy had done his work in Alexandria, a Chinese pioneer, Chang Heng, AD 78 to 139, had, quote, cast a network of coordinates about heaven and earth and reckoned on the basis of it. Within 2 centuries, the Chinese Ptolemy Fei Sui, appointed in AD 267 as Minister of Works to the first emperor of the Qin Dynasty, 265 to 420, applied these techniques to make a detailed 18-sheet map of China. The Great Qin Dynasty has unified space in all the 6 directions, he explained, and it was only appropriate that map makers should provide comprehensive maps, free of error and drawn to scale, showing, quote, mountains and lakes, the courses of rivers, the plateaus and plains, the slopes and marshes, the limits of the 9 ancient provinces and the 16 modern ones, commanderies and fiefs, prefectures and cities, and lastly, inserting the roads, paths, and navigable rivers. In preface to his atlas, Fei Sui gave simple directions for making a map to proper scale with rectangular grids. If one draws a map without having graduated divisions, he warns, there is no means of distinguishing between what is near and what is far, but a true scale representation of the distances is fixed by the graduated divisions. So also the reality of relative positions is attained by the use of paced sides of right-angled triangles. And the true scale of degrees and figures is reproduced by determinations of high and low, angular dimensions, and curved or straight lines. Thus, even if there are great obstacles in the shape of high mountains or vast lakes, huge distances or strange places, necessitating climbs and descents, retracing of up steps or detours, everything can be taken into account and determined. When the principle of the rectangular grid is properly applied, then the straight and the curved, the near and the far, can conceal nothing of their form from us. How did the Chinese develop so refined a technique for mastering the Earth's irregularities? From earliest times, it seems, they had made land allotments by a scheme of coordinates. From the times of the Qin Dynasty, the emperor's maps had been drawn on silk. The terms Qing and Wei, which Fei Sui used for the coordinates on his maps, were the same words that had long been used for the warp and the weft in the weaving of textiles. Was the idea of a rectangular grid on a map suggested by finding that a place on a silken map could be located by following a warp and a weft thread to their meeting place? Or was the origin possibly in the diviner's board of Han times that used a system of coordinates to represent the whole cosmos? Or was it connected somehow with the form of the early Chinese chessboard, which located pieces by their coordinates? Whatever the origins, the result is plain enough. A well-developed and widely used system of rectangular grids. In 801, during the Tang Dynasty, 618 to 907, the emperor's cartographer completed a grid map of the whole empire on a scale of 1 inch to 100 li, 1/3 of a mile, 33 1/3 miles, which measured 30 feet long and 33 feet high. Maps became so popular that they were found even in the imperial baths. Cartographers found ways to link geographical with celestial coordinates, and without interruption, they continued to elaborate their grid system. While Christian cosmographers were fantasizing their maps to fit scriptural texts, Chinese map makers were making unprecedented advances. More and more, the grid pattern imposed for human convenience dominates their design. By the Sung era, 960 to 1279, they are regularly placing north at the top. The Mongol unification of Asia under Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan in the 13th century brought masses of new geographical information to imperial mapmakers. With the passage of time, the grid becomes rather less prominent on the face of Chinese maps. A whole new cartography developed, called the Mongolian style, in which the map itself became simply a grid with no effort to delineate the Earth's erratic shape, but with the names of places and tribes inserted in their proper squares. By the mid-12th century, even before the general revival of Ptolemaic Europe, when the Arab geographer al-Idrisi made his world map in 1150 for Roger II, Norman king of Sicily, he too used a grid scheme, which, like that on Chinese maps, makes no allowance for a curved Earth. Perhaps, as Joseph Needham suggests, the long tradition of grid maps of China had reached the Arabs in Sicily through the Arab colony at Canton and through the increasing number of Arab travelers to the east. And so perhaps the Chinese played a part in ending the Great Interruption, setting European geographers once again on the path of knowledge, rediscovering the quantitative tools that were the heritage from Greece and Rome.